Sheltered people raised by super religion/cults. What was something about the real world that shocked you when you learned about it?
For me, it was a complete culture shock. People could do anything. Women could treat men as equals, not always defer to them. People treat other people with more respect. Adults are treated like adults. People could talk about sex and bodily functions like periods without being ashamed. People weren't afraid of living their lives in a way that made them happy.
In the first few months of being out of my parents' home, I learned so many new words and things I didn't know existed. I watched a lot of movies that would have been considered wickedly sinful in my former home.
I had to relearn how to talk and act with people.
Outside of the church, people do everything different, and the people you can and can't trust are different. I felt like I had the IQ of a normal 8-year-old in the real world. 2. Where is all the sex and drugs? I was promised wanton lascivious effing in the streets.
3. Grew up fundamentalist Christian and was homeschooled all the way to 18. College was a huge shock.
I, now 27F, didn't know what a penis was until I was 19 and took an anatomy class that year.
I had no idea how to handle any social situations at all.
I got a lot of attention from both guys and girls just being normal and wanting to make friends. But I ended up dropping out because I couldn't handle how overwhelming the attention was. Also during that time I got my first job where I met my first boyfriend.
He took me to his friend's house, and when his friend's mom walked in, for some reason she said, "Crap." It was the first time I'd ever heard an adult cuss, and it threw me off so bad I hid in the bathroom until I could calm down. 4. I was homeschooled until 8th grade, then went to a private school and a public specialty school. Didn't go to college.
I don't think I really figured out socialization until my late 20s.
I'm extremely introverted, but the lack of other people during my younger years combined with the religious indoctrination really screwed me up for a long time. 5.
Yes, my parents taught us that cursing was a sin. They did teach us a few words so we would recognize them, even though we were never around other people that used profanity anyway.
I had never even heard a kid cuss either, mostly because I never had the chance to be around other kids, not even other homeschoolers. There was a local homeschooling community in my area, but my mom never let us sign up for anything even when we begged her. There were groups for sports, creative writing, baking and home economics. But I and my siblings were never allowed to do any of those. There was a homeschool choir I got to do once when I was about 10, but then I wasn't allowed back. To give a little more perspective on just how isolated I was, my mom hated me having friends. I made my first friend at that choir, and summer break was approaching, which meant we wouldn't see each other for months.
So we swapped addresses and decided to be pen pals. We wrote a few letters to each other, and then suddenly she stopped replying to my letters. I was really upset and asked my mom if she knew why my friend stopped writing to me, to which she told me that her family had moved. Years later I brought this up to my older sister, who was then absolutely shocked.
She said what actually happened was that my mom started intercepting our letters.
She would get letters from my friend and throw them away immediately, claiming she was bullying me. And then she would send mine, and just toss them.
That girl never bullied me.
I never felt bad around her, and she was a really sweet and fun little girl. My sister said she snuck into my room and read some of the letters to make sure this girl wasn't actually bullying me, and was shocked because it was literally nothing but innocent kid stuff, like how many Polly Pockets did you get for your birthday, etc.
Pretty much we went to church and then back home, and that was it.
And we never had any sex education. I wasn't even told how to take care of my periods, just that they happened and that my dad thought it was gross, so I had to make sure I hid it, and I ruined a ton of genes figuring that out myself.
I'm doing much better now. I'm a lot more confident, going to therapy and now married to a really sweet guy. I even cuss myself now, lol.
Thanks for the questions, I hope I was able to clarify. 6.
This is relatable.
I was like 23 before I realized how messy it made me come off, just standing there waiting for someone to order me around. During teenage years I was able to cook, clean, do laundry, blindly bend/complete to any type of authority figure, and not a whole lot else.
Really made me resent my family for a few years until I realized one thing. My mom, dad passed during my teen ages, genuinely thought and still thinks she did the best she could.
She sincerely believes that there's a God who wanted her to raise us the way she did, and if she didn't, then we'd all be in hell.
Even though I was woefully unprepared for the real world, at no point did I ever feel like my parents didn't love me.
So how can I be that mad then?
My resolution was to deal with that the same way I deal with everything else and adjust accordingly to the world around me. 7. Didn't realize that Christianity wasn't the default for adults.
Didn't realize it's not normal to treat your family like garbage while being a super nice charismatic human to everyone else, more of a narcissistic thing, but since I was so sheltered and they were so strict and obsessed with being in control, I had no idea.
Didn't know that not everyone has an ulterior motive when speaking to you.
Was raised with the girls inside doing women chores and the boys outside helping with man chores.
Grew up and realized some men actually cook and clean as well. What a shocker. 8. Experienced a similar thing. My mother was extremely religious and couldn't understand why I would want my own space when I was a teen. One of my coworkers blatantly told me I was sheltered, and I asked him what he meant. He just kinda sighed, but he did explain that I seemed very clueless about the world. I was 18, including entertainment stuff. My coworkers would try to strike up a conversation about a movie or song they like, but I wouldn't know what it is 90% of the time. It was embarrassing, but another coworker let me use her Disney Plus since she thought it was criminal that I hadn't watched Encanto before. And I've since binged most of the movies on there.
I will always be grateful to her for that.
9.
I am still waiting for someone to offer me free drugs, cigarettes, or sex. According to my highly religious Jehovah's Witness upbringing, these things were everywhere, and every single person not in the truth was partaking in one of these three things at all times. 10. End is nigh. Oh, I'm waiting.
Cristo viene. I wish he would.
You've been left behind. Yep. To suffer like the rest of us. Grew up in a rapture-centric evangelical household. Parts of it were loads of fun, some just straight up trauma porn. Y2K was a hoot in my house. We definitely believed it could all end, given all of the televangelists hopping on the doom train.
The part that shocked me the most, or affected me the most, is that you don't realize until you are older that you really did believe the world would end, well, soon-ish. The idea of getting old, worrying about retirement, whether my aspirations would materialize, most of those things seemed more far-fetched than the apocalypse did. 11. Lost sight of my parents while out shopping? Probably the rapture. I guess I missed out and I'm about to go through the tribulation.
I'll be damned, I guess.
I can joke about it now, but back when Satan woke me up to tell me it's hopeless and I am hellbound, that really got to me at the time.
People who think the apocalypse is a couple years away raise their kids not well.
12. That I could meet atheists who are good people, with a better moral compass than most religious people. Rebuilding my system of ethics after culty religion was mind-blowing. It was mind-blowing, and I am a better human for it. Atheism has taught me to be responsible for my own actions, that I need to hold myself accountable. I have only one life, therefore I should live it to the fullest. Learning and studying is a form of appreciation for the universe that you simply don't find elsewhere. That the concept of a higher power has nothing to do with religion or God. Humanity can be a higher power just as my personal potential can be. The fact that there is no God forces me to live in touch with the reality around me, always. I have met too many religious people who are the Webster definition of the scum of the earth, and it sickens me they don't see what a moral or ethical standard actually looks like. BTW, born and raised Orthodox Jewish into a family of rabbis. Atheist since I'm 20. 13.
As a Jehovah's Witness, you're told your whole life that the outside world is always out to get us, because we have the truth, and people don't like that because they want to live in sin. When I actually interacted with people outside the cult, I realized that most average people didn't even really think about Jehovah's Witnesses, much less have it out for them. 14. The fact that you can be abused and not know it because you think it's normal.
15. How taboo alcohol was. I grew up in a highly religious organization where if you ate at a restaurant and someone in your proximity had a beer, you would have to stand up in front of the congregation and ask their forgiveness for the appearance of evil. Lol, I drink all the time, but I don't tell my fanatic part of the family because they would die. 16. Highly Mormon extended family I stayed with regularly. And not just Mormon, I mean living on a hill, out in the desert, isolated from other humans and having multiple wives who were forced to stay in the kitchen. Mormons. Think the weirdest thing to me was realizing most religious folk had lives outside of religion. Though all religions dictated your outfits, diet, schedules, and even vocabulary. Their cult wrapped God into everything they did, so I thought that was the religious default. The thought a Christian could drink a Dr. Pepper without considering if God condoned that, seemed strange.
In a way, it is strange. If you truly believed that you had an inkling of some font of morality, wisdom, and potential punishment at the very highest levels of the entire cosmos, wouldn't it make sense for you to be fretting about every little thing in that context? What if your all-powerful God has a strong opinion on Dr. Pepper and you just got lazy and didn't think to check in?
Yikes. For the sake of saving yourself a little bit of time and enjoying a finite worldly pleasure, you potentially messed yourself at a cosmic level.
17. In my 20s I atheist, was engaged to a guy who'd grown up a homeschooled preacher's kid in a 500 population mountain town before moving to my East Coast metro and joining a public school in 9th grade. He and I dated during high school and through college, and at no point had I ever seen him pray, go to church, or talk about religion other than recounting stories about his upbringing. He also happily accompanied me to museums with dinosaurs and evolution and was a STEM major, so he would have encountered this stuff at school too. It never even crossed my mind that he might not believe in those things until one day, 4 to 5 years into our relationship, it came up that he believed in creation, not evolution. I was shocked. Floored. It sounds kinda silly, but it made me completely re-evaluate our relationship because learning that about him felt completely left field. I never told him how bad it shook me and made me question our future together. We did stay together though, and our relationship ended a few years later for unrelated reasons, but it still weirds me out to think about. He's actually some kind of neo-pagan now, which seems more in line with his personality and interests. 18. Not raised religious, but raised by an incredibly sheltering parent. Turns out I won't be raped, mugged, and murdered for simply existing in a city setting without a male escort. 19. Dude, my mom raised me on a belief that I was property of men and that I was supposed to save myself for my husband. But she also taught me that every single man out there was just trying to tempt me into giving away my gift to my husband. She would teach me to never go out without an escort, or I would get sexually assaulted and have my virtual stolen. Probably because all 5 of her daughters before me had been sexually assaulted by family members/school teachers, acquaintances growing up, so she had a very negative view of men by then. Not to mention, she's been through 10 marriages, and they all cheated on her. 20. A complete lack of privacy isn't normal. I was raised Mormon and was homeschooled most of my life. My parents installed camera inside the house to watch me all times of day, hid trackers on my car and lied about them, and took away my phone and went through it every night until I finally moved out. Not to mention our doors didn't have actual locks, so they would break into my room at any time for any reason. They even asked me about extremely intimate details of my sex life after I came out as gay and they realized I was sexually active. Around the time I started college I realized this behavior isn't normal, and moved out a couple of years later. They still don't see anything wrong with it, and have the cameras up to this day while my sister still lives there. 21. This one hits home for me. Blindly following authority because authority is ordained by God. If my teacher, boss, police officer, anyone of authority tells me to do something, then do it. I can't tell you how many hardships I went through because I just complied to said authority and LaShore trusted said authority. There are many terrible people in the world without your best interest at heart, and I was naive. It affects me to this day at 29 years old. 22. When I found out Joseph Smith, prophet, martyr and founder of Mormonism, married over a dozen women behind his wife's back. Grew up being taught Joseph Smith was just a 14-year-old farm boy who saw God and was commanded to restore the one true church to the earth. He married multiple women only with his wife's consent, and after an angel with a flaming sword commanded him to. He was killed by a mob after being framed unjustly for crimes. Finding out the fucker tried to assassinate a governor, burned printing presses to stop negative news coverage, and married 14-year-olds was a real trip. Grew up Mormon, so maybe you're looking for something more extreme, but the narrative is so different to reality and was the foundation of all truth for me and most members. I hope it qualifies.
23. That people outside our in-group weren't evil. I grew up in a fundamentalist Christian church where I constantly heard that others were satanic, malicious, contrary to God's plan. Even other Christians from different denominations were said to be on the wrong path. Once I left the church, I thought hordes of godless monsters were supposed to attack and persecute me with their anti-Christian, LGBT, communist, Marxist, atheist, Democrat, cannibal agenda. You mean to tell me they're just other people, wandering around, living their lives? Enemies exist, but not nearly as many as the church warned me about. 24. I'm still amazed that there are so many people who genuinely nice and want to help others.
I was constantly told that when I left, people in the world would take advantage of me.
But I've met more genuinely nice people in the world than in the Jehovah's Witness church. 25. Being able to openly like the art, music, movies, etc. that I liked. I know it seems like a minor thing, but I couldn't listen to rock music or watch horror movies because it was seen as the devil's influence. Once I left and met people of the world, it was nice to share music and movies with others and not be shamed for it. 26. That women do enjoy a lot of freedom compared to the community I come from, which is fairly religious, almost cultish.
I don't know a single female in my community educated beyond school.
Or one who had a say in her marriage or her life in general. The authority to dictate women's lives passed from the father/brother to the husbands.
27. The insane amount of violence and death used to spread Christianity across the world. I was taught missionaries spread the good word of the Lord to people that were godless. I wasn't taught that it was at the tip of a sword and they destroyed all remnants of any religion they found.
Why would violence and destruction be needed to get people to adopt a religion of love and peace? 28. Nothing as major as here, but my wife's family is extremely religious. Her grandfather was even a cult leader, a few books written about him. Can't get into details for sake of privacy, and it blows my mind how ignorant her whole family is. And I don't mean to sound like a jerk, but ignorance in the way of the most basic social cues and interactions and even words in conversation. I'll be talking to her aunts and uncles in their 60s and they'll have so many things they've never heard of. It blows my mind.
She has 2 aunts who actually took classes to learn how to have normal conversations because they were so odd. It's weird.
Even my wife is still learning and growing vocabulary and she's 39. 29. That most of the world has never even heard of and doesn't give 2 shits about Mormonism. Growing up, I thought it was Mormons versus anti-Mormons with very few people in between. Realizing that the Mormon cult is like 0.1% of the population, and that people generally don't care to learn about it, was crazy. And also, just realizing that most people who do know about the church are just really lukewarm about it and not at all fazed or interested. 30. This is a minor one, and my denomination growing up wasn't really cult-y, pretty mainstream conservative, but anyway, I didn't realize how tiny my denomination was.
I grew up in the Christian Reformed Church in a pretty small, homogeneous community.
I was aware that we had fellow churches all over the USA and Canada, basically anywhere Dutch people settled, but I had no idea that all Reformed denominations combined account for maybe approximately 2% of American Christians. I also didn't realize that most denominations don't push Christian education like the CRC does. Obviously many Catholics are pretty invested in their schools, but generally mainline Protestants aren't so worried about it. That actually used to be a significant point of contention between the CRC and the Reformed Church in America. And yes, there are like a dozen XYZ Reformed churches.
31. I can give you some insight on the opposite. Many years ago, I worked in a warehouse with a guy who had gotten married right out of high school, and subsequently joined a church in which every member was related to his wife, except him. It was basically a group of inbred weirdos who followed the insane orders of their crusty grandpa. My coworker was in his mid-30s. This was in the 1990s when I knew him, so he'd been in the cult for well over a decade by then. He wasn't allowed to own or watch TV.
Or any movies. He couldn't listen to any secular music. He had a telephone, but he could only accept incoming calls, and wasn't allowed to call anyone. When he was sick, his wife would come in and report it in person. His home was a single wide trailer in a trailer park largely populated by others of his sect. His living room was bare except for a sofa and an upright piano.
He often talked about how he'd play piano all evening, as it was his only form of entertainment. None of our other coworkers liked to do deliveries with him because, Frankly, he was a weirdo, and more importantly, he wouldn't allow the truck's radio to be played, nor would he tolerate smoking. I didn't smoke, and could entertain myself, so I was his de facto partner. On those rides, he'd often ask me weird, random questions, like, is the Smurfs still on?
Or, what's Night Ranger doing these days? Keep in mind this was the mid-1990s, so the answers were, no, and, who the fork is Night Ranger, respectively. He'd also ask me things like, do a bunch of black guys still play basketball?
I don't really know what that meant. Sometimes, when we'd go to places like Best Buy, where there was a wall of TVs, he'd get almost mesmerized, and I'd have to keep a close eye on him or he'd be lost for an hour. Around the warehouse, he'd often stop coworkers from describing the movie or show that they'd seen over the weekend, as he wasn't allowed to know about that stuff. One time a coworker found his phone number, called his house, then held their phone up to the TV, and flipped through the channels.
He freaked out, and reported it to management.
Fortunately, it was the 90s, so he was told to shut up and to get back to work. Ours was a meager living, and as such, it was not uncommon for my colleagues and I to face financial trouble.
It was such an occurrence that led to his piano being repossessed. This caused him to have a near mental breakdown. My mother was a music teacher and church pianist, so she always knew somebody who was trying to get rid of an old piano.
I offered to help him find one, and to help move it to his trailer. He refused on the grounds that he wasn't allowed to accept charity.
32. Religious person doesn't equal good person. This realization was the deciding factor when I was on the fence about how I felt about religion as a teenager. I felt like it was always just expected that a person should be religious by default, but it didn't really resonate with me and I had a lot of guilt over it. One day I was being told about this guy the first was going to meet and how he was such a great man, very religious and devout, deeply involved in the church and such. Within 10 minutes of meeting him he had said a bunch of judgmental and racist crap completely unprompted. That was the moment I decided I had no qualms about my feelings and that I could be a better, more moral person than that guy without any association to religion.